Football is the world's greatest sport, but this game, which is supposed to unify people, is being plagued by serious cancer: racism. How did we even get here?
Racism in association football is the abuse of players, officials and fans because of their skin color, nationality or ethnicity. Some may also be targeted because of their association with an opposing team. However, there have been instances of individuals being targeted by their own fans. The topic of racism in association football has been widely covered by the media as well as academic studies. There have been a range of responses by various associations such as FIFA and UEFA, as well as by teams and individual players and managers to address the problem. Racism in sport, especially football, had been long rooted in the game since the inception of professional competition at the turn of the 20th century. At a time that most associations and leagues only started taking issues of racism serious and instituted sanctions and punishment in the 1980s. England, Italy and France were the worst offenders, and the rampant attacks on black players spelled doom for their leagues as they began to be televised. Criticisms from outside compelled these European leagues to hurriedly take cover-up measures such as placing wardens to police offenders in the crowd, as well as issue fines and bans to offenders, but this has done very little to stamp out the canker. The most recent case of racism in Italy we witnessed had Nigerian striker Victor Osimhen being abused on TikTok by his own club's official page. This caused an uproar throughout the world of football, leading to the club's apology, one that doesn't really change anything. Osimhen's case simply adds up to the thousands of young black and African players who have faced racial abuses in Europe, South America and even North Africa. Classic examples of early cases recorded in the 1980s and 90s are Chris Hughton, current coach of Ghana's Black Stars, who used to play for Tottenham Hotspur, and Emile Heskey, former England international. Hughton was constantly hailed from the terraces by the fans of the club, while Heskey was reportedly spat on and called the N-word. In the 1990s, when the exodus of African players into Europe increased, it came with a new wave of intensified racial abuses on these young players who, regardless, thrived and chalked success in their clubs. Racism has so far been classified as an endemic phenomenon in the sport. It is as if nothing seems to work against the problem despite all the effort being made. If you would consider the contribution of African players to the growth and success of the leagues in Europe, you would acknowledge that without these imports, the European leagues, including the UEFA Champions League, would not have been as competitive and entertaining to watch. In fact, the talents from Africa has been one of the main reasons for the financial growth and exposure of Europe's top 5 leagues and clubs, with Abedi being the first black African player to win the UEFA Champions League in 1993 with French club Olympique Marseille. 25 other African players have helped their clubs reach the summit of the European Club Championship. Thousands more have helped the clubs win league titles and cups across the continent. Translating these wins runs into billions of euros in return for these clubs who have African players playing for them. According to KPMG's analysis football benchmark in 2021, there were about 600 contracted footballers from Africa playing in Europe's top 11 leagues, with the majority of them from West Africa. This makes up to 6% of player population. At the time of the report, 21 African players in Europe each had a market value of over 30 million euros. The English Premier League alone hosts 13 of these 21 African players. The number of African players in foreign leagues away from the continent increases when we add up those in the Middle East, Asia and South America. This tells how enormous the financial gains of these clubs and leagues are from the players from Africa. And this is just a contemporary context, not to talk of what has been contributed to these clubs and leagues in the past decades. Indeed, great value is what has been gained from African talents over the years. Now, this raises eyebrows as to why the African players are being treated unfairly by the fans, the media, and even clubs when they go to Europe to ply their trade. Italy's romantic relationship with racism has been well documented throughout the history of football.
Well, the referee's had a word with the stadium manager, it would appear, and something's happened. Something being thrown at Samuel Eto'o, or he's getting very hot under the collar about something.
No mercy, Senna, no more.
What is happening to Victor Osimhen isn't new. Many black African players have been subjected to mockery, chants, violent attacks and abuses from fans, the media and clubs in Italy. Several reports suggest that the president of Napoli wants Osimhen out of the club by the next AFCON. If he voluntarily leaves the club, it will mean more profit for Napoli, which is why the club wants to make him uncomfortable. It has also been reported in the past that the president of Napoli hates the idea of players leaving the club to play the AFCON, which happens in the middle of the European season. He's vowed not to entertain African players due to this reason. It is recounted when Kalidou Koulibaly was threatened of not being released for Senegal during the AFCON 2021 competition. Similar acts run throughout Europe, even though these players bring so much value to the clubs they play for. The constant attempt to devalue and disrespect players from Africa has now become an exposed agenda with the advent of social media. Thankfully, these platforms have given African players, fans and media a voice to speak up against the hate and unfair treatment against African players. Africa's talent abounds. All over the world, you're sure to find an African footballer playing professionally somewhere. The demand for African talents have led to leading clubs in Europe such as Real Madrid, Barcelona, Metz, Bayern Munich, Ajax, Manchester City and so establishes academies on the continent to groom talents for their clubs. In recent years, several individuals and organizations, both within Africa and from beyond, also have established similar academies to groom talent to feed into leagues in Europe, South America and even Asia. The growth of such academies are testament to the lack of necessary infrastructure to take care of budding young players. If local clubs and government invest in the growth of the game in Africa for Africans, it will be able to develop stronger leagues to rival the likes of those in Europe and South America. We have seen how strong leagues in North African countries such as Morocco and Egypt have been able to retain great players within their shores while improving their value to the rest of the world. I believe that being able to retain players in strong African leagues and competitions where they are assured of respect and honor as they deserve will strongly signal to clubs and their leagues in Europe that they should treat African players better than they currently do. But until this is achieved, African players, the African media and fans have a responsibility to tackle acts of racism with the resistance it deserves. We must protest, speak up and ensure that whoever propagates hate, regardless of their position, must be punished. African media especially should dedicate airtime in discussing racism in European football seriously and draw the attention of stakeholders to the fact that African players must be protected always. Boycotting clubs and leagues with high racism tendencies is also a laudable mechanism to expressing our displeasure with racial abuse. These players who get the opportunity to play in Europe are able to contribute significantly to the growth of the economies of their hometowns, communities and countries. Sadio Mane is a classic example for his philanthropic work back home in Bambali in Senegal. Many other African players playing outside Africa do invest in businesses that employs young people, supports families and build dreams of many other people in their various countries.
African players are the world's best talent. Racism is a cancer in the sport, and we must continually fight it until the game we so much enjoy is free from this disease. Reporting for the Kente Business Journal, my name is Rahel Redwa Okuku from Accra, Ghana. So I'm here with my colleague Echo to hear his thoughts on this issue. Now, Echo, how does racism affect the performance of the players, and how does the European media's handling of issues of racism affect the value of these players?
Racism definitely does affect the performance of the players, because we see that players who tend to go through such abuses turn out to be traumatized. They go through a lot of trauma, their mental health definitely is affected, and when you are not sound up there, it definitely is going to show on the outside, no matter how fit or physique you are, or a good physique that you have, it's going to definitely show on you. So I think it is something that we definitely have to stamp out of football. Football is a beautiful game that we all love, so we have to make it a point to be able to kick racism out. And talking about how the European media's handling of such issues of racism, devaluing the players, it definitely is a contributing factor to how the players, overall aura around the players, or how the players themselves are sort of compared to other players when issues of racism come up. The European media does not necessarily do justice to African players who are abused racially, or black players who are abused racially, in the sense that sometimes you realize that they find faults, whatever faults it is, with the players, and also try to defend whoever the perpetrator is in a way. And I feel racism is racism. There's no way that racism can be, compared or anything. It's just racism, and it has to be stamped out. So I think we, the media in Africa, or those of us who work in the media space in Africa, have that sole responsibility to defend African players. We have to talk against racism and make sure that it's stamped out.
All right, so coming down to Africa as a whole, what contribution do you think that we can make, so that racism against football players, against African players in particular, is stamped out? Because day in, day out, we see them defending themselves individually. Should we have a body in Africa that will be at the front line fighting for racism against these players?
Yes, we should. Some people will say that there's a Confederation of African Football, and what has CAF really done when it comes to issues of racism? I personally do not see a lot of work from CAF when it comes to issues of racism. Ironically, I don't. I rather see UEFA, the European body, doing a little bit more to stamp out racism in the European football, because it's very rampant over there. Racism is also rampant in North Africa, where players from Sub-Saharan Africa go to the Arab parts of Africa to play football. They also do experience racism over there. So I think a body in Africa to work against racism is very, very important. It could be through the media, it could be through an independent body that is going to solely handle issues of racism, solely defend African players, find solutions, or even if it could be legal backings to support such players when issues of racism come up. So I think it's a good idea. As to how it's going to be implemented, we need to sit down and discuss that really, really further. Maybe all the stakeholders have to come together, and I really urge CAF to look at issues of racism. I really urge CAF to stand up, protect the players who come from Africa, because these players, when they do well, the monies they make comes back to Africa, comes back to their hometowns, comes back to their communities. They invest in business which employs so many other African youth. They invest in sporting infrastructure that supports younger talent or the next generation. They also do invest in the economies in their various countries. And all of these things are the little things that come together to build up the country or the continent as a whole.
Well, I think the world, and especially the European football governing body, the leagues, the teams that these African players do play for, should take responsibility and offer sanctions against these perpetrators of this cancer. Because at the end of the day, these players are playing for your leagues. You are making the name and the money out of these players. So it is your responsibility that their mental health, their well-being should be your priority. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you very much for watching this video. Please do not forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel Kente Business Journal TV and press the notification bell to stay updated always.